What word or phrase comes to mind when you hear socialism?
Joseph Stalin. No, I'm kidding. Probably rose, red rose.
Philip?
I'm too politics-brained, right? Like, you can't say that and not expect me to come out with, like, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is the first thing. But it's like, how boring an answer is that? How about Das Kapital, just to mix it up a little?
Yeah. Welcome to Impromptu, where we will be discussing theory for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes.
This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the news we can't stop thinking about. I'm Molly Roberts, a columnist at The Post.
And I'm Drew Goins, author of the Today's Opinions newsletter. This week, we're talking about democratic socialism, what it really means, and what the vibes about it mean.
The 33-year-old self-proclaimed democratic socialist Zoran Mamdani surprised nearly everybody this week in the New York mayoral race when he resoundingly defeated Andrew Cuomo and the rest of the Democratic candidates in the primary. His campaign platform was unapologetically progressive, or even more than progressive. He promised to make buses free, childcare free, rents not quite free, but at least frozen. And he said he'd pay for all of it by taxing the wealthy.
So were his economic ideas and affiliation with socialism what really excited so many New Yorkers? And what might his surge in popularity tell us about the politics of young people today? Are they actually drawn to socialist ideas, or do we just not like what's on offer from today's political system?
Today we have our colleague Philip Bump here to get into all of this. Hi, Philip. Welcome to Impromptu.
Why, hello. Thank you for having me.
So, Mamdani's platform was almost exclusively targeted at helping the working class.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things when you look at the results is that he won in a lot of wealthier areas of the city. So is there a disconnect here? Why do people who have plenty of money to spend on, fancy pants groceries, why are they going for his idea of a city-run grocery store?
There's a lot packed into that question. So it's a nice first question for me to really knock me back on my heels.
This is a nice slow pitch right over the plate for you.
No, we know you can handle it.
I would say, first of all, that I don't know that the primary driver for a lot of voters was the government-run grocery store. So you selected that, and I understand why you did, but I do think it's worth pointing out.
I'm a single-issue voter myself, so.
on that particular thing.
Yeah.
But I do think we tend to conflate particular policy ideas with rationales for voting, and I think, in this case in particular, I think there are a lot of reasons that Mamdani was successful that expand beyond that. That said, it is also the case that a lot of this rhetoric that is focused on progressive ideas and, the overlap between that and socialism, which is obviously very blurry, a lot of that appeals to college-educated voters. And there's a strong correlation between college education and income because college educations tend to get people more income. And so part of that is that he did better in better educated places as well. And I think that it's sort of hard to disentangle those. The more educated you are, the further you tend to be to the left. That's true on the Republican side and it's true on the Democratic side as well.
If only we could control for whether voters had read Das Kapital sophomore year of college in some sort of seminar.
Right.
I was going to say these are wealthy voters, but not the wealthiest voters who went for Mamdani. Generally, if you have a view of Central Park, I think you went for Cuomo, or if you're older, you liked Cuomo better, kind of those stodgy, older voters. And we can talk about the city-run grocery stores in particular because it does not feel like the most important issue. I'm very sorry, Drew. But it is useful if part of what you're trying to do for yourself, for the people around you, is signal what you believe in with this vote.
Right.
I may not need these grocery stores, but other people do. And I am someone who holds morally correct views. And also I have a general aversion to capitalism. Screw the big chains.
Yeah, I think you're right in that this was, I hate to go back to a sort of 2023, 2024 word, but that was sort of a vibe-based element of it, right?
Right.
That not only is it this particular policy idea and sort of a suite of policy ideas, but it is this idea that this is a candidate who's willing to say, you know what, we keep hearing that we can't spend tax dollars on this stuff. I disagree. We're going to spend tax dollars on the sorts of things that are going to make working people's lives better. And that is a meta argument that I think is the better sales pitch than the specifics of what that meta argument is aimed at. And I think that's the sales pitch that differentiated him from the Democratic establishment, differentiated him from the wealthy New Yorkers and particular business owners in New York who are basically up in arms at this point about his having won the primary, and put him on what essentially became a glide path toward the nomination.
Molly presented an argument that a lot of voters might have made to themselves in making the selection that felt very ideological to me. But the kind of message that you just encapsulated from Mamdani, Philip. I wrestle with like what is vibes and what is ideology, right? Are they the same thing?
Sure.
How much overlap is there? Because I really do question how ideological voters ultimately are. I think a lot of times we map ideology onto voters, large blocks of them, when that really isn't much of a motivator.
Well, I don't know. For a lot of young people I know in New York from college, so again, the kind of really particular group we're talking about here, obviously there are other people for whom the main thing isn't vibes or ideology. It's just practically what is going to help you in your life. And that was
Right.
big for Mamdani too, affordability for people who genuinely have affordability issues. But these people I know, the vibes are the ideology. So to talk more about the generational divide,
Yeah.
Right.
polling before this vote found that Mamdani was overwhelmingly supported by people aged 18 to 44, whereas older folks were leaning hard for Cuomo. I feel like I'm hearing echoes of the generational divide in the Democratic Party more broadly today. Do the hordes of millennials and Zoomers too swooning for a far-left candidate tell us anything about what young people are looking for in today's political atmosphere writ large?
This issue of young voters is a particular fixation of mine, so I'm happy to go on at length if you desire.
I'm just going to step out for a second, grab
Please.
grab a sip of water.
Read Das Kapital while we're waiting. But I had a book come out in 2023 that looked at the transition between the baby boom generation, which is now of retirement age, and the millennial generation, which is almost as large in terms of population as was the baby boom, but of course it's in a larger national population. A lot of what has defined Democratic politics basically since 2016 is this divide between this cadre of younger people within the party and the older establishment, right? And this is more of a problem on the Democratic side because Democrats are more dependent on younger voters to support them. Younger voters are more hostile toward the institution of the Democratic Party, which is part of the reason why candidates who say that they are socialists or not Democrats like Bernie Sanders have more appeal because they are not part of the party institution necessarily. And young people don't really particularly care for the institution or care about the institution. I think the millennial generation has sort of aged into being more of a political force, and the millennial generation is advocating for things for itself that are different than what boomers and older Democrats are advocating for, right? And it's simply a stage of life issue, right? Younger people have young kids and they're worried about schools and they're worried about daycare and they're worried about affordability. Older people are worried about protecting home values and they're worried about the retirement and they're worried about Social Security and things along those lines. Obviously, there's overlap between those two groups, but they're two different constituencies advocating for two different things that the Democratic Party has to worry about more than does the Republican Party. And I think one of the indicators we saw that we are seeing, I think, with Mamdani's victory, an emergence of the millennials as a force that we had not seen before. Now, there's 1,000 qualifiers to that, right? Ranked choice voting is different. New York is different. It's a very liberal city, yada, yada, yada. There's all these qualifiers that should and do apply. That said, I do think the fact that the establishment took this bad a hit is an indicator that we may have reached this pivot point, which we could have seen coming for quite some time.
Well, thank you for calling us a potent political force. I think we need the ego boost a little as a generation.
Well, I was going to say, you know what issue cuts across generations? Groceries. So you both can mind your P's and Q's. Philip, what you said about millennials emerging as a political force, are we able to nationalize this? There have been a lot of people rushing to nationalize element A, B, C, D, E, F, G of this race. But I feel like the emergence of millennials is a real force to be reckoned with. That feels pretty undeniably nationalizable.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's not nationalizable. It is inevitable, right? I mean, this is, it's people get older and they vote more, right? It's more that the parties need to figure out how to control and tame it. Now, there are a lot of asterisks to this too, right? One of them being that we saw younger voters who had been basically since 2004, but really in 2008 with the advent of Barack Obama, really voting divergently from older voters, much more Democratic. We saw them sort of fold back into the norm in 2024. They were less likely to be that extremely Democratic, mostly because of younger men and among those younger men, heavily because of non-white younger men, right? But we saw this shift. And the question is that shift temporary? Is it related to Trump? Is it related to inflation? Is it all of these various things that are the lingering questions around 2024 and may never be resolvable? But it is inevitable that people who are millennials and Gen Z are going to become more and more of the voting population. Ergo, their issues are going to be more and more of the conversation. And I think that the Democrats remain better positioned nationally with that group. And I think it changes the nature of nationalized politics. So even though you're going to have Fox News out there and Donald Trump saying, Mamdani's this, radical Muslim socialist, yada, 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 I don't know that that holds the same sway among a population of voters that is less attuned to the narrative channels that appeal to the right, like Fox News and right-wing social media. And so it remains to be seen. It is coming, whether you like it or not. I do think Democrats are probably better positioned for it.
Yeah, the language Trump used, I believe, was 100% communist lunatic, which I believe just means that he really appreciates Das Kapital.
Yeah. It's a little over the top.
100% communist lunatic is appearing on T-shirts in Bushwick as we speak, I think.
That's probably true.
I wanted to point out, too, before we got too far away, that Mamdani not only overperformed with young voters, but especially and specifically with new voters as well. So I think that really just underlines exactly what you're saying, Philip.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, again, he was a very compelling candidate. And it is not the case that the Democratic Party is going to be able to find equally compelling candidates across the board, right? AOC, very compelling candidate. They have not produced a lot of AOCs over the course of the past decade, right? So there are a lot of other factors that go into this. But I do think that Mamdani's approach to the campaign is something that is more replicable. And I think that, again, the Democrats are going to have a better time of replicating that than are the Republicans.
Okay, we are going to get more into the socialism of it all and whether people even know what that is or have decided it means something different person to person. But that's right after the break.
Welcome back. I'm Molly Roberts, and I'm here with Drew Goins and Philip Bump talking about socialism.
Wow, I feel like I'm at a dinner party in 2017.
So, Mamdani is a proud democratic socialist. Welcome at every Bushwick dinner party in 2025. He's similar to people in the left flank of the Democratic Party like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, plus a whole lot of those people on Blue Sky with rose emojis next to their names. Is socialism a draw, and why? Are people just looking for something anti-establishment right now, or is it really about the policies? And I guess another question is, what are the policies? Do people even totally know what democratic socialism is?
Okay, so here's what my gut says. There are some people who are hardcore Marxists and who believe in Marxist ideology and who approach politics through that lens. I think they are rare. I think it is more the case that socialism has been contrasted with capitalism for obvious reasons and for a long time, but very acutely, particularly since the economic crisis that emerged almost 2 decades ago now. And so when we talk about the two approaches one can take to economic equality and fairness and distribution of wealth in the United States, those tend to be the poles. And so if you are not someone who is lining up with the Bill Ackmans and Elon Musks of the world and the fervently and endlessly pro-capitalist approach, then you are more inclined to side yourself with the socialist. Now, the shift that we were discussing before the break in younger people being less likely to sign up with the Democratic Party. And it is stark the extent to which young people are less likely to be members of a political party than are older Americans. They are independent-minded, and they don't see themselves through the lens of the party. I think one of the big challenges Joe Biden had, for example, was that there were a lot of people who were like, look, he's the Democratic nominee, and a lot of young people were like, so what, right?
Yeah.
And so they weren't feeling loyal to him simply because of party affiliation. But if you combine the opposite of capitalism, socialism, and you combine the, I'm not a member of a party, I'm an independent, if you get someone who comes up and says, okay, I'm something different. I am a democratic socialist, and what I believe is that we should, make it so that people have access to America's wealth in a way that increases taxes on the wealthy and provides more benefits to the rest of us. There's an enormous amount of appeal to that, right? And that's particularly the case in a heavily democratic place with a lot of young people like New York City. And I think that this is going to continue to be a factor in national politics. In 2016, Bernie Sanders made a run for it, basically running on this platform as an outsider, as someone who took this approach to capitalism. And he did pretty well. In 2020, he did even better until the establishment came and stomped on him. In March of 2020 to give Joe Biden the nomination, essentially. That's oversimplified and people get mad about it, but there you go. Then we had Ocasio-Cortez in 2018, and now we have Mamdani in 2025, right? There is a progression of success, which I think is not an accident.
This is what I mean when I say that a lot of the American Gen Z millennial socialism feels like a vibe, because it really is about positionality, as you were saying, Philip. When you get down to it, a lot of what these candidates are running on is social democracy, right? And if you want universal health care, right, if you want subsidized childcare, that stuff is all under the umbrella of social democracy. If you don't want, state-run planned economies, right? I don't think that people yearn for Chavism.
You might be surprised.
Okay, yes. Yeah. There are plenty of people out there. I think when a lot of people who are not super steeped in Marx and theory and everything else yearn for a better world, I think what they are yearning for is just things to be more affordable and the state to pay for more things. And, sure, they run grocery stores. That is proper socialism. But I think a lot of the stuff that's really popular and really resonates with people is something more along the lines of social democracy. But as soon as you say that, it's, oh, no, this isn't socialism. This is social democracy. That's so pedantic. And you immediately lose the vibe, right? Suddenly you're cozying back up to capitalism. And the whole point of the rebelliousness of it, the mavericky nature of it is immediately lost.
Yeah, I think if a candidate goes out there and says, I believe in universal health care, I believe in free college, I believe in higher taxes on the wealthy, it's like, yeah, that's great, but you're not going to be nearly as much of kind of a viral phenomenon as Mamdani managed to be. And I also think you're going to be more likely to be criticized by people who have a bigger problem with capitalism and who aren't as interested in compromises where still most of the economy is capitalist.
Yeah.
I understand the appeal of declaring yourself a socialist to kind of run on the fumes of the vibe. But on the other hand, obviously, it's highly toxic to a lot of people, particularly older people. Maybe they don't matter anymore, but they all say, oh my gosh, Cold War, and they're immediately turned off. The mere mention of socialism has them leaving.
Well, I think a good part of the strength of the socialist label comes from the criticism of it. Because so often people be like, oh, so pie in the sky, this utopianism. And the response to that is like, well, is your message just that things are bad and are going to stay bad and we can't fight for a better world? I think it's this unabashed optimism that really powers the movement.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I also think that we can't overlook the skepticism that Democrats who say they're going to do these things, but who are fervent members of the Democratic Party evoke, right?
Yeah,
if you are an Andrew Cuomo and you come out and say the things Mamdani says, people aren't going to believe you because you're a Cuomo, for God's sake, right? Like you are the Democratic establishment by virtue of birth. So I do think that you can't just say these things and expect that people are going to be like, okay, I get it, and I agree with you. There has to be an independence to it because the Democratic establishment itself is now so toxic. And I don't think that's permanent, but it is in this moment toxic. Mm-hmm. I go back to the generation things. It's so beholden to this old class of Democrats, people who are extremely focused on trying to figure out, continue to this Bill Clinton triangulation to try and get people in the middle. And that effort to triangulate and to try and get people from the center and pick off maybe, loose Republicans who aren't particularly attached to the Republican Party. The problem is that by trying not to alienate them, they're alienating their base of younger people who want to see more action, want to see more engagement.
Right.
And I think the Mamdani moment may be one in which the party says, okay, you know what? Let's just lean into becoming the party that is fervent and actually does these things and takes a strong stand in favor of these progressive ideals and is worried less about this triangulation and see what happens. I don't think the party's going to do that with the current leadership because this leadership is, it is an establishment. But if you look at what the Republican Party did, right? And I'm not saying it's good, but the Republican Party in 2012 looked at what happened in that election, said we need to do a better job of reaching out to non-white voters and we need to be more expansive. And then Donald Trump came along. It's like, actually what we can do is wring out more and more votes out of white people, right? And he created an entirely new Republican Party. And it is not, there are downsides to that, right?
No.
But it is the case that he, as someone who managed to capture the zeitgeist of what the base was feeling, shifted everything about the party and made it successful. But the Democratic Party, that's not the approach they're taking. And this may be a moment when, because of this generational shift, it's a risk that they can afford.
So after this Mamdani moment, what is the next moment for American socialism and the moment after that? Is there a chance that the party gets remade? What happens with socialists?
A chance that the Democratic Party gets remade? A chance that the Democratic Socialists of America get remade? A chance that they merge?
All of the above. I'm waiting for Philip to say, "Oh, Drew, great question. I'm actually going to, go to town on this one."
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I'm going to go to town on this one. Look, it's hard to predict the future. And it is, again, the case that we're talking about New York City and we're talking about Democratic primary. And those are not factors that by themselves indicate that we have a pattern that can be applied evenly across the United States. That said, very soon we're going to start talking about the 2028 campaign. We talked about the progression from 2016, 2020, and 2018, and now with Mamdani of the strength of socialist candidates. And I do think there's going to be space in 2028 for someone who comes from the outside. I've had a conversation with someone not too long ago in which, is all this talking about, who's down in South Carolina and going to Jim Clyburn and so-and-so. And, my point was I don't think that's where the 2028 Democrat comes from. It doesn't come from that old hacky, this is what the establishment does. I think it's a totally different dynamic that's going to emerge. I don't know who it is, but I do think that person is going to be someone who is able to credibly claim being outside of the Democratic establishment and is someone who is very sympathetic to and espousing the sorts of policies that you hear from Mamdani and AOC and others.
Yeah, I think we're in this tough spot where saying social democrat, the Democratic Socialists are worried that is going to turn people off or it turns them off because it might sound like it has a big D.
Yeah.
And then if you say Democratic Socialism, the Democrats are worried about that turning people off because it says socialism and socialism is scary. And so when we're in a place where either of those phrases doesn't feel totally toxic to so big a section of the group of people who might be disposed to vote for someone who identifies as either of those, then we're in a far better place than we're in now. But I don't know when that happens. Someday, inshallah.
Okay, well, on that note, we will wrap this up. It was great talking to both of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and Regina DeHeer, edited by Jasmine Green, and mixed by the magnificent Emma Munger. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne.
Thank you for listening to Impromptu. Please send us your thoughts about Mamdani's victory and democratic socialism by emailing impromptu@washpost.com. And a sad programming note, you can continue to listen to Impromptu with Dana Milbank every Tuesday, but this is it from me and Molly, at least for now. It has been so much fun getting to have these conversations with you every week. So thank you for joining us. And stay tuned for what's to come.